Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you aboard this morning, coming to you from Virginia Beach, Virginia. And my mysteries will not be as ancient as many of the people who are presenting this weekend, but I would like to delve into the American soul because as young a country as we may be, the roots, at least of our spirituality, go back thousands of years. And I'd like to also talk about what's going on in the American soul and how that's playing out today across the nation, even right here in Virginia Beach, Virginia. So the crisis of the American soul. Let me share a story from David Brooks. You may have heard of David. He is the columnist over the course of his life with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. You can see him today on PBS. And a few years ago, David went through a monumental crisis in his life. He got divorced, he got sick, he lost one of his jobs. He lost a lot of friends because of the divorce. And he looked back on it later and said, you know, it wasn't so much a psychiatric or medical crisis I went through. It really was a crisis of the soul. What did he mean? Now, as he covers what's going on in America, he believes as though he has a great deal of empathy because, and this is what he says, as much as what the country is going through is an economic and health and political crisis, it is a spiritual and moral crisis at its root. He says the pain is felt in suicide rates, opioid addictions, the highest depression rates we've known, and just how badly we treat each other. Is it a spiritual crisis? Is it one of the soul? Well, I think John Meacham would agree. You may know of him as well. He is the brilliant historian and commentator. He's the author of The Soul of America, An American Gospel. And earlier this year in a New York Times editorial, John Meacham suggested that only a religious awakening and spiritually inspired activism could be the only way out of our current dilemma. Now, these are strong words from men who rarely wax metaphysical. Maybe another author, Neil Donald Walsh, had it right that our politics is our spirituality expressed. So I would submit that our polarization that we see and feel so starkly today is really not so much merely a political divide. It's a division in consciousness. And in some ways, it's really nothing new in the American story. These forces have been within the American soul now since our birth, and they have pushed and tugged and yanked at one another now for centuries. To one degree or another, it's just that they're showing up more starkly now. And I would submit that they're showing up more starkly to converge, to somehow be reconciled. And I would also go a step further that the underlying current of this divide in our nation right now, in consciousness, is largely reflected in the issues surrounding religion and race. And those are precisely the issues raised by Edgar Cayce in that fateful year of 1939. Here he and some of his friends are at the A.R.E's Congress in June of that year. They didn't call it Congress at that time. They called it the Cayce Convention. But a number of amazing readings came out of that conference, and they would become part of the classic 3976 series of readings, which are on national and world affairs. And Cayce at that Congress addressed, quote, the mass thought of the American nation, its ideals, principles, and purposes, among other things. And in one reading, Cayce warns the United States. There will be division in thine own land, in religious thoughts, religious principles, racial concerns, strife between capital and labor, which are mass as well as individual and group thought. And these, as they are stressed, become more and more of a problem. Ye are to have turmoils, mob rule. Not for the faint of heart, is it? Well, first off, we know two things about the Cayce readings. Number one, that they were not verdicts, they were warnings, which means that they could change. And secondly, even if they did result in manifestation at some point in time, the dates or timing could be off. Now, I know a lot of folks believe that this particular reading refers to the 1960s. Cayce himself said within this reading himself, this will happen before the second president to die in office, which would mean somewhere between FDR, who died in 1945, merely months after Cayce himself, and JFK, who was assassinated in 1963. But I think that that warning is far more appropriate for what we're going through today, because the polarization that we're feeling today is more intense than the 1960s, even if we would expand it beyond JFK's death. It's certainly more intense than before JFK's death in 63, but even if you were to stretch it out and say, well, it pertains to the late 1960s as well, I would submit to you that our polarization is more stark today. Yes, at that time we were going through racial tension, the Vietnam War, the horrors of the Democratic National Convention in 1968, and of course the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy that very same year. Horrifying time in American history, no doubt. But today the divide and the polarization is far more tribal. And it is grounded in an ideological and religious separation that I think is far more severe than we experienced back in the 1960s. Back in the 60s, you know, as opposed to today, our institutions weren't fraying as they are now. We didn't question so much our free press as broadly as we do now. We did not worry so much about the Supreme Court and the politicization of our Supreme Court. We certainly believe that Congress could be a check on the executive branch, on the presidency. 5 years after, in the early 1970s, we see what Congress ended up doing with Richard Nixon, and essentially a figurative impeachment, if not a literal one. And today we also worry about the safety of our elections and even the peaceful transfer of power. Now, in the 1960s, the center held, as tough as things got. Will it today? And this stark polarization, how does it reconcile itself? Is there a reckoning coming? Now, we know, and I'm sure David Brooks and John Meacham would agree, this is the most polarized we've been in over 100 years, the most polarized we've been since the Civil War. And in addition to this polarization, we're dealing with some existential crises around the world. The pandemic, climate change, the rise in autocracy throughout the world, civil unrest, mass migration. But the one thing that comes up again and again, whether you listen to David Brooks or John Meacham or Edgar Cayce, is that we Americans, in the toughest of times, have always found our way through. We ultimately have been able to find our way to unite behind our ideals. And in Edgar Cayce's readings and what he demonstrated in his life shows us a way to unite this divide. And I'm going to share ideas from Cayce, of course, and some other lauded teachers, such as Eckhart Tolle and Alan Cohen. But let's first take a look at one of the three major issues that he raises in this reading about the United States and ye shall have turmoils. Let's talk a little bit about the religious divide. Now, the nation, of course, has always been based on religious pluralism. The founders loved the fact that there were so many different thought forms and religious forms and spiritualities that grew up in this nation. Why? Because no one religion could take over or dominate the others. There would be no church and state union. This would be a land of diverse spiritual expression. But I would contend that there are two major strands bubbling up right now from within the American soul. And they've been uneasy bedfellows, for sure. They've been inhabiting this American soul for a long time. And occasionally they do find time, they find opportunity to come together and to work in concert. One is the Enlightenment. And of course, for all of us who took history civics or American civics and history, we know that the Enlightenment was based on reason, that there was a great veneration of science. Unless we think these people who were part of the American Enlightenment were not spiritual, I think we know better. We know that their spirituality, for the most part, actually almost all across the board, was based in an esoteric spirituality with ancient roots that went back to ancient Egypt, went back to the Hermetic wisdom tradition. Let's face it, most of the founders were deists, and they were Freemasons, Unitarians, they were Rosicrucians. They extolled the inner light of Quakerism. Now, as a response to the Enlightenment came the Great Awakenings of America. And these were really fervent, emotional, Christian, religious events. And in some ways, they were the largest events that the nation had ever seen. As a matter of fact, when you talk about some of the great preachers of the first and second Great Awakenings, you're talking about crowds of 8 or 10,000. George Whitefield actually had almost 25,000 people in Boston to listen to his evangelizing. So in some ways, we see this push and pull. We see this interaction between these two poles, if you will, of American spirituality. And I would contend that this is feeding the polarization across the spiritual spectrum in America today. And what do I mean? Well, at one end, we have what is conservative religion. It can come in any stripe, but I'm speaking mostly of conservative Christianity, conservative evangelicals, charismatic Catholics, and their roots are deep in the first and second Great Awakenings in this nation in both the 18th and 19th centuries. And of course, in the last 50 years, they've become a prominent religious and political force in the nation. At the other end, we have the SBNRs, the spiritual but not religious crowd, and the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and that means nothing in particular. This is the fastest growing group in the belief spectrum. 25 to 30% of the electorate is ascribes to no particular religion, or they are spiritual but not religious. Now, lest you think that this group is primarily made up of atheists, even if you think the nuns are primarily made up of atheists, you'd be wrong. The roots of this group are tied into the American Enlightenment in the 18th century and the Transcendentalists in the late 19th century. They're more likely to appreciate a mystical, ecumenical, perennial philosophy, a golden thread, if you will, that runs through all religions with ties to ancient cultures. And in the middle, we have mainstream religion. But in the last generation, I was actually in the last 2 generations, since going back to the 60s and the 80s, through the 80s, we started seeing this center become a keg tapped at both ends. People started moving to the religious left and to the religious right. So we see this attrition in mainstream churches, mainstream Judaism. Many of the mainstream religions have lost members to one side of the spectrum or the other. And I think you can see this today if you were to ask a person a simple question: is this a Christian nation? And those on the more right-hand side of the equation would say, absolutely it is. Those on the left-hand side of the equation might say, might mimic Thomas Jefferson, who said the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So in some ways, I believe the life and the readings of Edgar Cayce came in to help reconcile these polar opposites. And why I personally believe he's going to be such a gift, he already is, but will be such a gift, a demonstrable gift to the evolution of American spirituality in the 21st century. Here was a white Christian male, born to a Southern family, who was devoutly Christian. And early on, of course, we know that Edgar read the Bible. Heck, in 1895, as a teenager, he meets the biblical literalist and evangelical giant Dwight L. Moody. He was probably, I don't want to say the Jerry Falwell of his day, maybe the Rick Warren or maybe the Joel Osteen. Edgar even had a dream about Dwight L. Moody that comes up later, how Moody doesn't really know how to handle Cayce and his gifts. But in Cayce's readings, much like his life itself, the ideals spoke loudly. And I think part of his mission, and maybe ours as well, is what I would call this convergence, this coming together and acknowledging the equality of religions, of races, of color, of genders, that Cayce, again, in his readings, but just as importantly in his life, came as a unifier, came as one who integrates, coalesces, believes in ecumenical religious approaches. Cayce, the man, though he was deeply, devoutly, religiously Christian, he and his source in the readings were inclusive of all world religions. The readings accepted all paths to God. So the question is, how will Cayce's philosophy play out in the years ahead in the United States as these beliefs continue to converge, as they show up more demonstrably from within the American soul? Some way the lights are blinking red between the left-hand side of the spectrum and the right-hand side of the spiritual spectrum. How will they converge upon one another? How will they reconcile this divide? And will Cayce's ecumenical philosophy eclipse the isolation of religious fundamentalism? Now, aside from the growing pangs of religion, Cayce also talked about racial concerns in that reading from the A.R.E. Congress in June of 1939. And again, keep in mind, this is merely months away from the beginning of World War II. And so many of the readings that he conducts that weekend have to do with world affairs, have to do with America. This is really on the minds of people, what was going on in the world and what was going on in the nation. So when we talk about convergence, there's no greater need in the American soul than the integration of race. Carl Jung said that as an individual or a collective, such as a nation, advances in awareness, it must engage its shadow, its disowned self. And America has never had a greater opportunity to engage this shadow self than at present time. Now, again, going back to the June 1939 Congress, Edgar's wife, Gertrude, asked this pointed question: what should be our attitude towards the Negro, and how may we best work out the karma created in relations with him? He is thy brother. They that produced, they that brought servitude without thought or purpose have created that which they must meet within their own principles, their own selves. These should be taken in the attitude of their own individual fitness, as in every other form of associations. For he hath made of one blood the nations of the earth. Interesting, right? Cayce's talking about maybe some of the karmic debts, some of the responsibility of a race of peoples themselves, but warns at both the beginning and at the end of this answer to this question in this reading is that we are really all made from that same divine cloth. And Cayce believed that resolving racism, at least according to the readings, here's a quote: all depend upon the effort of individuals to all live as brothers, one with another. And in the same reading, he says, no other principle, not even the idea of democracy itself, ranks above the brotherhood of man. There will be no want when mankind eventually realizes he is indeed his brother's keeper. Who is his brother? Each of every color, of every creed, is the brother of those who seek the Father God. So there are those two issues, once again, race and religion, color and creed, as the keys to unity, as the keys to spiritual awareness and spiritual evolution. Now, again, we know what the readings and what they had to say, but when it came to matters of race, Edgar walked the walk. Edgar's life in some ways is a symbol of spiritual evolution, and I think a primer for ourselves. He's born in Kentucky in 1877. This is only 12 years after the Civil War. So you know this couldn't have been easy for this soul. It's well known that Hopkinsville was part of Kentucky, was in Kentucky, still is, and had been a slave state. It was one of the border states in the Civil War, which meant they really weren't aligned necessarily with the North or South, but slavery was permitted and slavery was ubiquitous throughout Kentucky. So when Cayce is born, his grandparents had been previous slave owners. Again, 12 years after the war, so, a decade or so before his birth. Thomas Jefferson Cayce owns some slaves, not many, but he's a slave owner. What about his father, the squire? Well, Hugh Lynn Cayce, of course, Edgar's son, recalled in his memoir that Edgar's father, Leslie, the squire, was, quote, fanatical in his hatred for Black people. Fanatical. That he organized an insurance company that was based on the purity of the white race, and he would not sell insurance to anyone who had Negro blood. A few weeks after Cayce's arrival in Hopkinsville himself, because they were on the farm, and I think in late 1893, early 1894, they move into Hopkinsville, and almost immediately thereafter, there's a public lynching of a Black man. And years later, in Christian County, which is where Hopkinsville is located, an African-American male was accused of frightening a young white girl. And he was lynched, and his body hung in that area, in that county, for 2 days as a reminder of racial superiority. And the town library, the seats on the train, the ballot box halls, the schools, even the bookstore where Edgar worked were all off premises to Black residents. One Black man whose son later became a noted journalist with the New York Post, and his son also became a member of FDR's Negro cabinet years later, was upset at the fact and expressed it to the town leaders that why should Black soldiers, Black veterans, who had come home from World War I, march at the back of the parade? This incensed him, but the pushback was so stark and so steep that this man was forced to leave town. Now, the Cayces moved on to Selma, Alabama after Hopkinsville, and I know I've commented to several of you folks involved at A.R.E. before. I may have said it in one of my previous talks. In some ways, Edgar is the Forrest Gump of the metaphysical world, because things show up. They just seem to show up. So he moves to Selma, and you say, well, that's not, nothing happened particularly in Selma, but think about how that became an icon in the movement in America for racial equality and equal rights. So he moved to Selma, Alabama, and while they're there, the squire is part of a letter that gets sent to a Birmingham newspaper. And the brunt of the letter is about how racial purity must be preserved at all costs. That without racial purity, the nation would disintegrate, that most of the values tied into racial purity would devolve and be lost. Hugh Lynn again recalls in his memoir that the squire and Edgar, quote, would have long involved arguments over the racial question. Because you see, Black lives did matter in Edgar's life. On multiple occasions, when Cayce is young, it's an African-American who shows up and appears at a critical juncture. When Edgar is a baby, an African-American woman named Patsy Cayce was the only person who had a solution to his intractable crying. Again, when he's a young boy, Edgar is out fishing one day in a pond. He slips in and he's drowning. In fact, some say that he did drown, but an African-American worker who's walking by the pond sees Edgar's hat on the surface of the water, goes into the water, rescues the body, and then resuscitates him and saves his life. When Edgar was 10, he developed a serious infection that the doctors weren't able to cure. It was only a folk remedy prepared by Patsy Cayce's daughter, Emily, that did the trick. And it was an African-American woodcutter known as Crazy Bill who told Edgar his first Bible story about Samson. And this is what inspired Edgar to pick up the Bible, which he would read every single year of his life. And by the way, he missed out on those first 10 to 12 years. He actually went back and caught up, if you will. So by the time he dies, I think at the age of 67, he's read the Bible through a minimum of 67 times in his lifetime. Now, later in Edgar's life, as the gift, his channeling gift, his source gift the readings. He does give several readings for Black men and women. In fact, the files include Edgar's correspondence with them, and one in particular, he says, "I assure you, it's our desire to be of help, if possible." Now, one of the rubs here, of course, is that the squire lived with the Cayce family for many, many years. I mean, he dies only, 10 or 12 years before Edgar himself, something like that. You folks know better than I do, some of the aficionados in the audience today. But on one occasion in 1933, because the squire was known to be in on the readings, I think he conducted some of the earlier readings. Gladys Davis, of course, who became the great transcriber of Edgar's readings, and of course the keeper of all of these readings. The reason we have the benefit of reading them today, she knew about the squire's attitude towards African Americans. And one day in 1933, Edgar gives a health reading for a Black woman whose husband actually was part of one of the first Search for God study groups. And Gladys observes, "We felt that Edgar remarked on the fact that Mrs. number 343 was a Negro for the benefit of Mr. L.B. Cayce, the squire, who was present. Mr. L.B. would have refused to conduct a reading for a Negro." Now, Cayce went on to give more readings for Black Americans. One in particular is an author named Jean Toomer, who was a well-known novelist, had a best-selling book. I believe the name of the book was Cain. He was part of the Harlem Renaissance. But what's interesting is he had a significant influence on Alice Walker, who was the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Color Purple. She said his book was indispensable. So one can only imagine the squire's discomfort with these readings for people of different races, ethnicities, and religions. Don't forget, at the time, white supremacists did not only have enmity towards Black people, anyone who was non-Protestant also fell in that category. And you have to wonder what he went through and what Edgar himself, who already had been evolving on this issue, but maybe witnessing what his father went through. When Morton Blumenthal, a Jewish man from New York, ends up funding the hospital and actually purchases the home that Edgar and the squire are living in. What did it feel like when David Kahn came and visited the home? One of Edgar's best friends, if not his best friend, a Jewish man. And although the squire was dead by this time, how would he have reacted knowing that Edgar's first biographer, Thomas Shagru, was the Catholic roommate of Hughlin Cayce? The Cayce's homes had a plethora of folks who came to visit them, from Indian Sikhs to Persian Zoroastrians. So the readings established time and time again that human souls pass from lifetime to lifetime, back and forth from bodies with one skin color to another, with equal human value. And if we go back to one of Cayce's infamous lifetimes, according to the readings, in the lifetime as Rata in ancient Egypt, in that defining life as that great priest, he had white skin. And he may very well have been one of the first humans to ever adopt a principle favoring racial purity. In one reading, Rata allegedly forbade a white woman from marrying the man she loved, who was of the red race. Now, the readings confronted these racist ideas that groups of humans with different colored skins should be kept separate. So Rata's choices created a karmic pattern for Cayce, which he experienced actually in that lifetime because he was exiled to Nubia with darker-skinned Africans, although he also met Hermes and purportedly built the pyramids together. But also another Cayce lifetime, according to W.H. Church, who wrote the book, The Lives of Edgar Cayce, he refers to a reading where the illegitimate grandchild of Louis XIV was Edgar himself, and he was rejected because of his dark pigmentation, which was apparently unacceptable to the one in power, his grandfather, Louis XIV. In his lifetime as Edgar Cayce, he had the opportunity time and time again to choose between good and evil. When born into a family and into a culture that placed the issue of racism squarely in front of him. And he chose to push forward in a more inclusive way. Now, I want to thank my friends, Sidney Kirkpatrick and Carol Sue James. Carol Sue, especially, I was already involved with some of the research, and she had a treasure trove of information. And I couldn't have done certainly this last segment without you, Carol Sue. So a tip of the hat to you. Thank you very much. Let's go to modern day a little bit more here, or at least integrate what Cayce expressed and what's going on today. You know, we cannot forget the portal through which Edgar came in this lifetime. Again, Cayce is born as a white, Southern, conservative Christian male with slavery roots. And whatever prejudices may have been associated with those cultures, Cayce overcame that with his staunch reading, believing, imbibing in the Word of God, reading the Bible not as a political force or as a cultural force, but as a deeply spiritual meditative force. Between that and trusting in his readings over time, we all know the story that when Cayce's readings started talking about reincarnation and started talking about experiences in other dimensions, and mentioned that other religions had merit, this challenged him, but in his own personal life, each and every time, he came back to trusting the readings. And he overcame maybe some of the cultural prejudices that were all around him, not just in his family, not just in Hopkinsville, but really throughout much of his life in the South. And with the nation coming to grips right now with matters of religion and race, the truth is that we are moving away from a male-dominated, white, conservative Christian America. Those are just the facts. Now, for some, that looks like evolution. For others, it incites panic and fear of loss. As the ancient mystical traditions of every religion now start to converge, we start seeing the equality among religions, especially in their mystical roots. And as these come to the fore more and more in this time period, as atheism tears away at the artifice of religious fundamentalism, as science, as shared by Dean Radin and Larry Dossey in this very portal a few weeks ago here at A.R.E., as science delves more deeply into what constitutes consciousness. If we look at the University of Virginia's DOPS program, as they look at the science behind reincarnation, our spirituality in this nation and the way we perceive ourselves is bound to change in a more accelerated fashion because it's already happening. And of course, the fear for some is that we're going to lose our religious purity, like that of race. Somehow, as we integrate, as we converge, somehow this purity will be lost or compromised. We'll all be part of a one world religion. We'll become a part of one colored light chocolate mocha race. This is going to, and already does, threaten established religion. Again, just as the integration of races and cultures and establishing equal rights among men and women threaten existing human institutions, especially religious ones. So as a nation grapples with the demographic changes in race and in religion, Robert Jones, an evangelist and author, in his book, White Too Long, he says, Christianity's role as a cornerstone of white supremacy has been largely overlooked. It demonstrates how deeply racist attitudes have become embedded in the DNA of white Christian identity over time. So given the tenor of the country, these groups, these thought forms may not go quietly. As there is a convergence of world religions, of various races, and again, it could simply mean interdependence. It doesn't mean one group being subsumed into another. Again, there will be that fear of one world religion, of a new world order. And this could manifest in the kind of turmoil that Edgar referred to in that reading from 1939. And it could threaten the very foundations of our democracy. In the same series of readings, again, the infamous 3976 readings, and for any of us who are students of history and students of Cayce, this is the treasure trove. There are numerous questions in that 3976 readings that dealt with Edgar Cayce during that one decade, thereabouts, mid-30s to the mid-40s. And it's interesting. I know that some people are put off by the fact that Cayce actually said that Hitler could be a force for good. And we look back on that and say, how could he have said that? But Cayce always said, as long as he avoided falling into the trap of self-aggrandizement, or if imperialism does not enter in. And again, throughout the 30s, those readings about Hitler became more and more dire. And in late 1938, Cayce was asked if what was happening in Hitler's Germany, dictatorship, autocracy, authoritarianism, religious, cultural, and racial horrors, if what was happening in Germany could happen here. And here's what Edgar said. Well, here's the question. What effort should be put forth to prevent the same thing happening in the United States? Answer, see that the Constitution is kept, and it can't. And in the same series of questions, is there any reason to feel that our democracy will fail in the United States? The people may fail, the democracy will not fail. That then becomes the condition in the land. One of the things I write about in this upcoming book that I am putting together, and hopefully will be out in the next few months here, in America's Next Great Awakening, are the recurring stories, the recurring positive myths, if you will, that America will never be defeated by an external enemy. Abraham Lincoln, some 20 years before the Civil War, gave a speech before the Young Men's Group and Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. And in that speech, he says that the Declaration and the Constitution must be the religion of a secular society, that nothing is greater than the rule of law. Lincoln also made very clear in that speech, America would never fall to a foreign enemy. England would never cross the Blue Ridge Mountains. A Bonaparte France would never drink water from the Ohio River. The only thing that could defeat America was from within. 2 trains leaving the station. Now I have another quote here from Edgar Cayce over the time periods, and this is only my 3rd or 4th talk here at A.R.E. But many of them do deal with America. So there are so many quotes that I could share with you today that Edgar speaks about the nation. But let me pull one up that I have not used yet in a talk. The ideals, the purposes that call the nation into being are, well, it might be answered by saying that there needs to be on the part of each man, each woman, the adhering to those principles that cause the formulating of the American thought. E pluribus unum, out of many one. Will America shift and change? Will she awaken? That's her destiny if she chooses to accept it. Could it be violent? Will it be largely peaceful? Eckhart Tolle was asked a few questions in Unity's magazine a few years back, and actually the woman asking the questions is the current minister of my Unity Church in Chesapeake, Virginia, Paula McDeasy, Paula Koppel at the time. And she asked these 2 questions to Eckhart, and I think they're instructive of this moment. Your teachings are contributing to a global shift in consciousness. How do you perceive what is occurring? A huge number of people are going through the process of awakening, some in early stages, some in later stages, and it's wonderful to see. It takes a while before it filters through to the economic, political, and social structures. The tendency is for people who run those structures to be still completely identified with the ego. So maybe it will take a while before it reaches the politicians, but you never know. Does the fact that this awakening is occurring convey a sense of hope for the world? Yes. The question is, does the old consciousness need to carry on until it actually brings about its own downfall through chaos and collapse? Or is the new consciousness arising that can gradually replace the old consciousness without excessive destructiveness? I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to wait and see. All we can do is take responsibility for our own lives. And let me leave you with just a couple of more points. Keep your eyes on this man, Joel Osteen. I write about this in my book. That in some ways, Joel Osteen is the center of the spiritual barometer in the United States. Oh, no, that can't be, you're saying. You know, we have a saying in the law that if you create an agreement, contractual agreement, if both sides are a little displeased, you probably have the right agreement. If both the spiritual but not religious side and the nuns are not happy with Joel Osteen, and neither are the evangelicals, he might be onto something. Joel Osteen, of course, is a quote-unquote evangelical preacher, but Joel Osteen preaches from the gospel, if you will, of Ernest Holmes and the Fillmores of Unity, and many of the other New Thought and esoteric, even some would say theosophical roots that come out of the late 19th century. All of his talks deal with the positivity, how mind truly is the builder, as Edgar Cayce would say, that your mind is what determines the quality of your life. But after he goes through about 90 minutes of pure new thought, you make sure you go to a good Bible-believing church. So in some ways, Joel Osteen is a real convergence of both evangelical, conservative Christianity, and in other words, the Great Awakenings, that's really at the root of some of his preaching, and New Age, New Thought. And even recently, he came out and supported Black Lives Matter, saying that George Floyd was the turning point for him personally. And here he is in a picture meeting with George Floyd's attorney. And finally, my mentor, Alan Cohen, shared this recently. He said, I heard a spiritual teacher liken our current world situation to two railroad trains leaving the station at the same time, in direction at a slight angle to each other. As the trains depart the station, they are close to one another, so if you wish to transfer from one train to the other, you could jump the short distance. As the trains proceed on their different tracks, they move farther and farther apart. The distance between the trains increases until it's impossible to jump from one to the other. Our current political, economic, and COVID situations call each of us to choose which train we are on. We're experiencing two radically different realities with no overlap. One mindset is represented by fear, judgment, hiding, and resistance. The other is trust, connection, mutual support, recognition of a higher reality. Straddling or alternating is no longer an option. So these trains are really trains of thought. The tracks are love and fear. And just to circle back, David Brooks was asked, will the ability to care for each other, do you think, heal our politics? David Brooks, yes, I have total confidence. As does John Meacham, who conducts a Hope of History podcast. And in it, he talks about how America has always found its way through. I want to thank you for this time this morning and just remind you that if you would like to subscribe, go to my website, ChristopherNaughton.com. And now I'm open to any of your questions or comments.